At the centre of this exhibition are these rolls of paper that were, they're somewhat like an artefact produced by the work Post Hoc, which was New Zealand's national pavilion at the Venice Biennale in 2019. So it's kind of a relic or an artefact that the work produces over the course of the 7 months, and it's about, I think it's like 10 to 12 kilometres of paper, printed paper, of a list of names of things that have vanished, disappeared, gone, become extinct. And revisiting the project here at the Adam Art Gallery it's been quite confronting in a way, because the project opened in Venice a year ago, almost to the day. I think it's taken me that long to sort of catch my breath after the event and all of that kind of work and intensity that project represents for me. I really think about them as a work. I've enjoyed thinking about them in the last few days during install and talking about them as being like locked up language. They kind of hold their own as a kind of form or a mass of the language that is at the heart of the project, that is now kind of in this kind of spent form. The paper is quite used and handled, and it's been sort of sitting in Venice on the floor for the length of the exhibition. And so I really am thinking about it as a work in its own right that sits alongside or next to the project which is more of a kind of a temporal event that unfolds as it's being exhibited. My interest in the document extends into that locked up relic that is generated by Post Hoc. And what's been really interesting in putting this exhibition together is just sort of discovering this thread of an ongoing interest that stretches into the past in relation to work that I've been making since I was in my early 20s, when I was actually still as an undergrad student. One of the works in the show was started when I was still at art school. It takes the form of a document. It's a letter, or it's a sequence of letters that really, also they relish in the kind of aesthetics of the document as something that I recognize in certain art histories. So, thinking about certain lineages of conceptualism that use language and text, but also the way it sort of hides or impinges on the everyday, in that letters, perhaps now a slightly antiquated way to communicate, at the time were a form of connection, of communication. The letters, are documents that point to an engagement with some other kind of force. So in the same way that the Post Hoc work might be a relic in its kind of in a sculptural sense, those earlier letter works also operate in that way, whereby there's a lot of concealed negotiation or information or withheld process that the document points to. There are some works from 2005, and they are titled line breadth drawings. They are hand-drawn A4 documents. Essentially, I've sort of mimicked the layout of a conventional legal pad, and then I have spoken onto those pieces of paper. So in the middle there's a kind of stain or a sort of residue of breath, in a sense, and they have had secrets read to them. They hold language in another way. For me, and thinking about the breath and voice and the mouth as a kind of a tool for the production of meaning, certainly as it relates to ideas or conceptualism, is something that I was thinking about at the time. And so these works sort of hold language in an impossible way. I think what this exhibition has kind of shown, reflected back at me, is an ongoing interest that I've had in this tension between revelation and concealment. So at the moment that something's revealed to you through a material or a title or a process that you see in a work, so there's something revealed, and yet there's all this kind of there's all these levels of concealment that are occurring throughout these works that stretch quite a large period of time. So I think in that tension between revelation and concealment, there's a really interesting proposition for the viewer, which is that they get entangled in the possibility of the work. So there's a work in the exhibition that dates back to 1998, and I was in my fourth year of my undergrad degree, and I lost my bag. I left it on the bus. I was taking the bus to art school, and I absentmindedly left it on the bus, and it had things in it. It was a kind of disaster in a way. It was a small personal disaster, and so I was making works at the time that were engaging with various art institutional kind of systems, and so I had the idea of registering this loss with an organisation based in London called the Art Loss Register, and they're a private company that track missing and stolen artworks, antiques, or antiquities mainly, antiquities and artworks. And so I paid a small fee to have my bag registered on the Art Loss Register, and received, confirmation of this, and that this was also, the first artwork of New Zealand origin to be in their system, in their database. And so that's in 1998. Move forward to 2019 in Venice. One of the lists as part of Post Hoc is a list of missing artworks, lost artworks. And I worked with the Art Loss Register. They were incredibly generous partners in some senses, and they provided me with their database as part of the project. And so spoken in Venice and printed here in the show, and entrapped in these roles, is my lost school bag from 1998. So it just was a lovely connection, both by way of an object that's missing, that's gone, but also through such a stretch of time, nearly 21 years. So that was a really beautiful discovery that Tina and I made together. What was I trying to do in that early work? I mean, I was young, and there's a mischievous kind of quality to that work that I still find really interesting. I think that work could only be, in a sense, be made by a person of the age that I was, my early 20s. There's an attitudinal force in that work that's about kind of pushing up against bureaucratic systems, and indeed manipulating those the conventions of the way that institutions and individuals kind of engage with bureaucratic forms, and so I think I was really kind of testing. I was interested in kind of a call and response with a lot of that work, thinking about the way that, rather than working in a kind of studio vacuum, that the work I was interested in making was sort of reaching out into the world in certain ways, and then waiting for a response for that world in order for me to then kind of react again. I think I was definitely interested in the inner workings of these institutional frameworks, in particular the art world, and how that operated. So Untitled Auckland Art Gallery dates back to 97 through to 98. And the work started by way of me writing to the Auckland Art Gallery to offer them my services as an undercover security guard. I wrote to them explaining that I was concerned about the safety of these artworks, and not just from the perspective of their tangible form, but also their conceptual reality. So in my letter, I state that I had been in the gallery, and I had noticed that some people had been spending what I deemed to be too long in front of certain artworks, and that I had identified some of these culprits as being students at Elam, the art school at the Auckland University, and that I was concerned that they might be stealing ideas. So I offered my services to the Auckland Art Gallery as an undercover security guard to try and police such things. So that letter was written and sent to them, and the response came back, thank you for your offer of free assistance and help to the gallery, but we are not seeking your help. To which I replied that surely this letter that they had written me needed to be decoded, and that I needed some more time to try and decipher the secret message within it, and that I could only assume that they wanted me to go deep cover, so to please get in touch so that we could start to work out a program around that. To which I received a response: we absolutely do not request your assistance in any form. And then it kind of just went quiet for a little while. That was that letter that was the last letter that just sort of sat there for some months. And then this really unfortunate and awful event took place at the Auckland Art Gallery, where an individual rode up to the entryway of the Auckland Art Gallery on a motorbike and jumped off his bike, ran inside with a sawn-off shotgun, and stole a painting called Still on Top by Tissot. He went to the gallery, ripped it off the wall, cut it out of the frame, rolled it up, got on his bike and left. And this was big news, and of course it was an act of violence, and it was there was also this kind of hunt for the work that took place. And yeah, as troubling as that is as an event, as a young troublemaker, I saw this as an opportunity to somehow, think about this work of my offer of as an undercover security guard in relationship to this event. So I wrote a letter saying that, had they taken my offer of assistance, this would never have happened, that I would take a bullet for the place. At which point, I was living in a flat on Picton Street in Auckland, and I was working in a cafe. I was at my job, and I got home, and there was a note on the fridge saying that someone named Chris Sains had called for me, and of course I recognized this to be the director of the Auckland Art Gallery. So I called him back, and I recorded the phone conversation where he, rightly berates me for my insensitivity, and so that is then pressed onto a 7-inch vinyl record. So yeah, this was this was the narrative of that work. And the work exists as a sequence of letters with a recording of this phone conversation, alongside a sequence of surveillance footage that I took off a screen that was surveillance footage of the thief ripping the work off the wall and cutting it out of its frame. The initial kind of drive to write that first letter could never have imagined the work in its final form. Certainly the events that were completely outside of my control were something I took advantage of in a way for this work to kind of evolve and develop in response to the real world. Private and Confidential is a work that I think grapples with that in a really interesting way. I mean, again, it's an old work, so it's with some distance that I look back at it. So I ended up discovering how they were getting rid of their office waste. And they were just putting it in a bag next to a public rubbish bin on the street at a given time on a given day. And I would wait for that moment and then collect that rubbish and then take it back to my studio and start to go through it and make sense of this thrown out material and try and understand the inner workings of this organization, of this business, of this thing, the art world. And what's really interesting about that act is that actually when someone throws something out, they are legally stating that they no longer seek propriety rights over that material. So when you throw something out, you're saying, I no longer seek propriety rights. That's material I no longer want. And what generally would happen in that instance is that you would have a kind of a contract with either the council who collect that, if it's in a rubbish bin, or with a private company where where there's a container that rubbish goes into. But it's in that moment that it's also sitting in a strange in-between space, a kind of nowhere land of ownership. And this was very much true of the way that this gallery was disposing of their waste, because they were just putting it on the side of the street, not in any kind of other bin. And in that moment, they are saying, we no longer seek propriety rights over this, so the ownership of which is kind of very grey, legally speaking. And so, yeah, I collected their rubbish, and they found out, and they seized the work. I was planning to show it in I think it was at the physics room. I was going to show all of this kind of material and these kind of findings. And I was asked if I would like to have a small show at Room Gallery, which is still operating today, an artist-run space in Auckland. And at the time, they were in this very strange kind of old dental surgery, and there was this sort of reception area in the gallery that had this kind of glass divider where the receptionist would have sat and where the patients would wait for their appointment. And on this piece of glass, I stuck all of the Post-it notes that were in the bin. There were a lot of these, so there was just kind of this array of Post-it notes. So the gallery heard about this and sent an individual who works for them, who worked for them at the time, who now was a gallerist in his own right, down to collect the work, to seize it. So I wasn't there at the time, but he walked in and seized the work, took it down, and took it back to the gallery. And a few days later, we were served, we meaning it was served to the gallery for me, or served to me through the gallery, legal proceedings. And it was a 3-page letter, which is in the exhibition. It's a 3-page letter where they're seeking damages. They're seeking all kinds of things. And so, but what's really interesting in this letter is that they start to refer to the rubbish as the artwork. So in their own definition, they've already kind of acknowledged that this rubbish has been transformed into something else, into an artwork, of which the ownership, vests with me. So all of this kind of strange, slippery stuff started to happen with the kind of the private ownership of what was deemed momentarily public, where I took it. So this kind of exchange of privacy kind of takes place through inside the work at the same time too, which I think is really interesting. I then had a lawyer who was interested in intellectual property law take on this as a pro bono case, and we penned a response. And in the end, it was a kind of out-of-court settlement that meant that I returned the rubbish. But of course, the rubbish was now artwork. So there's all this sort of interesting transformation that took place of this material. It was certainly full of subterfuge and intrigue, and the intensity of receiving a letter as I was in my early 20s, and the kind of fear and anxiety of that was actually quite intoxicating. Like in making these letter works, I really learned to enjoy the intensity of a moment, and the intensity of a moment as it related to an art making methodology. That rather than this kind of methodical, sort of careful sort of approach in a studio to producing meaning, there was this sort of out of control intensity to these moments where works would somehow just kind of arise out of these decisions, and often I'd have to make decisions that were good for the work but bad for me, or vice versa, depending on the circumstances. It's been incredibly revealing to do this, to sort of find this thread, or kind of illuminate a thread that, it sort of sits in the back of your mind, but it's certainly not something that is a kind of staged effect through time where these things are logically kind of connected. But it's really interesting to think about this kind of 22-year kind of space where there are these really interesting recurring habits maybe, or interests. And so the exhibition's been incredibly both useful and interesting to kind of think about those, that a kind of consistency that at the time is quite intuitive. Like, it's not something that is programmatically kind of done. It's just something that that's kind of sat underneath all of this kind of thinking and all of the production that I've been engaged with. Not all, but we've kind of looked for that retrospectively and found it, and that's been really intriguing. I mean, even just formally and visually thinking about the photographs of the stack of paper of the rubbish from the gallery in Auckland that I took from the side of the street, and that formally there's this kind of stack of paper. We understand these as documents. We understand it as detritus or remnants or unwanted, withdrawn material, and then we see from 2002 boxes of shredded material, of unwanted detritus, leftover material. And then we see in 2019 in Venice these reams of paper of kind of spent knowledge, and that this is this kind of relic produced by a work that reads the names of vanished and gone and disappeared things. So just kind of formally, those links are really interesting. All of this kind of paper, all of these sort of documents, all of this sort of language. There's so much kind of language that's present, but not language in the sense that it's an investigation into kind of the poetics of language, but language is kind of data and information. So those sorts of connections have been really interesting to have been revealed for me, and hopefully the viewer as well. And yeah, this ongoing interest in the unseen, like all of these the unseen rubbish from Galangsford, or the unsaid thing, or the stated thing that is a menace in a kind of bureaucratic kind of machine that has to be dealt with, or the unseen thing as it might relate to something that's vanished from our sight. I think the humor in those early letter works, there's also a kind of an absurdism in that humor. There's a kind of slightly absurd way to imagine that one might think that a student was stealing ideas by looking at something for too long. And there is an absurd quality to Post Hoc that one could assume to contain and hold all that is gone and vanished. And that's an impossible, improbable task. So the external framework of Post Hoc is full of shortcomings. It's full of holes, and it's full of gaps. And I think it's that opens the work up to a possibility for a viewer to find a way in. So yeah, it's interesting to keep thinking about that. I'm still thinking about it.